In this video, I'm going to cover engine starting procedures. I'm going to be using there's a PowerPoint for the flight deck, or what we call the cockpit. This PowerPoint, if you would like to follow along or are interested where it is, it's in the course documents section. It says cockpit familiarization. I made this video a few years back when I found it's hard to get 17, 18 heads in the airplane at one time. So it's best just to use this PowerPoint because it's the actual 172 that we have on campus. Anytime you're doing an engine startup, shutdown, anytime you're doing anything as far as operation of the airplane, you should always be following a checklist. This checklist is also in the course documents section, all the way at the bottom, the Cessna 172 checklist. That's what I'm going to be using. I'm going to keep it off to the side over here, but that's something that you always want to follow along to. So in this video, I'm going to show you, this is what it looks like if you're sitting in the cockpit. This is the pilot's control column, and there's some things over here, but most of what we're going to need is right here at the bottom of this panel here. To save time, I'm not going to go over any of the flight instruments, like this first one, the airspeed indicator. I'm just going to go over mainly this stuff right here on the bottom, and then the instrumentation over here on the right side. And the nice thing about this video is what I did is I zoom out, I take a picture, I put an arrow, and then I zoom in on that instrument. So like, for instance, if I went to the next page, it's going to have a close-up of the airspeed indicator. But I'm going to skip through that and go down to the stuff that matters for engine startup. So looking at the panel here, I'm going to zoom in over here. I think the first area is right here in the bottom left corner. It's going to zoom in there. So I'm going to stop at that slide. Once I get past this flight stuff, there it is. So showing this arrow, it's going to zoom in on there's something here called the master switch to primary, the ignition switch, and the fuel strainer. So let's zoom in on that, and I'll talk about what each one of these items does. This is called a master switch. The master switch is how you turn power onto the aircraft. If you got in the airplane and just turned the key over to start, nothing would happen. Because this is just an ignition switch. So the master has to be on. It's like getting in your car and having the battery disconnected. You turn the key, nothing's going to happen. So that's the master switch. That's turning electricity on. This is the ignition switch, also known as the magneto switch. I have a separate video on how magnetos works, but I'll talk about that in a second when I go over startup procedure. But the positions are right, left, both, and the start. And then this is the fuel primer for that airplane. How that works is like a syringe. You pull that out, sucks in fuel, you push it in, and it injects fuel directly into the cylinders to help to make it easier starting. Okay. The next things, so this is going to go through each one of those items I just talked about. I'm going to skip these flight instruments and again go back to the part that talks about something we need to know to start the engine. So these circuit breakers there. On the checklist, it's going to talk about how to make sure those are all in. These, the type of circuit breakers they are, if they're flush with the panel, they're in. If they were extended out or popped out, then that would mean that there's something wrong with that circuit. So you would end up having to go push it in and see if it stays in, or if it pops back out, figure out why it keeps popping out. Keep going here. The engine controls is where I want to take a second to talk about these. So the engine controls are kind of by your right knee. This is the throttle. Most airplanes, that's a black color, but this is the throttle. Basically, in is full throttle, and pull back is what they call idle, also known as retarded throttle. This is the mixture, and there's going to be a separate video on just how the mixture works on this course, on this online course. And then this over here is called the carburetor heat. Okay, and I'll talk about that in a separate video. I'm not going to spend time on the carb heat on this video. So on the mixture, how it works, and there's a video on this also, is when the mixture's all the way out, that's called full lean or idle cutoff. Basically, when this is talking about mixture, the mixture is the mixture of air and fuel. If you have all fuel and no air, or you have all air and no fuel, the engine's not going to run. Both of them are not very good conditions for the engine. So you need to mix that ratio so we got ideal burnable mixture. So that's what this knob does, is it controls the mixture. This knob actually is how you shut the airplane down. So when we want to shut the airplane down, if we pull this mixture all the way out, that's called full lean. It actually has a name called idle cutoff, and that's going to be all air, no fuel. When you push it all the way in, that's going to be a lot of fuel, not a lot of air. So that's how the mixture works. It pushes in and out, just like the throttle pushes in and out. But the throttle going in is full throttle. Pulling it back is called idle throttle. All right. The carb heat I'll cover in another video. The next instrument that's important to engine starting is called the tachometer, also known as the RPM gauge. This is going to tell you basically the engine revolutions per minute. And this is times 100, so that would actually be 500, 1,000, 1,500, 2,000, 2,500. The green band is the operating band range. The yellow is you're getting a little close to getting to its top speed, and then the red line is the never exceed. So that's what this is here. That's the RPM gauge, and that's something you're going to be concentrating on during engine runs. The next instrument that's important for engine runs are all these instruments. They're going to be right here, and they're actually in front of the co-pilot. This airplane's a little weird. Most of the time they put them on the pilot side so you can see them a little easier. This one you actually have to look across and zoom in on these 4 instruments. So let's go over what those are. The first ones, these ones on the outboard sides are on the left side and the right side. That's the fuel gauge. The reason they're showing no fuel right now is because master switch isn't on, like I talked about earlier. Oil pressure, that's very important to watch on an airplane. After you start, you want to check oil pressure within 30 seconds. Make sure you have oil pressure on a piston engine, otherwise you need to shut it down and troubleshoot. And then there's oil temperature. That's the other instrument there. That's what this PowerPoint's going to do, is it's going to zoom in on each one of those and talk about what they do. And that'll be it for as far as the important instruments. I'm going to go back to the top and go through a startup procedure with you guys, so you'll know what that is all about. So if you wanted to start this engine, the first thing you would have to do, and I'm going to be going through the checklist, you would have a pre-flight. You would get the pre-flight done. You would make sure your seat's adjusted and your belt's installed, your seat belt's installed, and your seat's adjusted so you can reach the pedals, because that's where the brakes are. And you'd want to have your feet on the brakes. Now, a lot of aircraft have a fuel shutoff valve. The fuel shutoff valve, actually, I believe it's at the very end of this PowerPoint. Let me go to it so you know where it's at. And I lied. I don't think it's there. Oh, there it is. It's actually on the floorboard in between the pilot and the co-pilot. And as you can see, it has a both position, a left position, a right position. And actually back here is the off position. So you can select burning fuel from the left tank, the right tank, or both tanks is where it's normally at. Or if you're going to be putting the plane in the hangar or something, you select off. So that way it keeps fuel out of the carburetor. So on the checklist, it's going to tell you to turn the fuel control on, and that's where you would do that. You would select most likely both. So I go back here. So we've got our pre-flight complete, seat belts are adjusted, fuel shutoff valves on. We're going to turn on any radios that we need if we're going to be moving. If we're not going to be moving anywhere and we're just doing a static engine run, we don't need to call the control tower. Nobody needs to be notified. I would just leave the radios off. But if you needed to turn the communication radios on, it doesn't mean like jam out, like have a music playing radio. It means communication radios. Then you would turn them on. You would make sure your brakes have pressure. You press on your brakes. Again, I'm going through the engine start checklist. Make sure your brakes have pressure, so when you start the engine, you don't start rolling anywhere. All the circuit breakers, you'd want to make sure they're in. Again, they're over here at the bottom of the panel. I showed you in a minute ago. Those are your circuit breakers. You want to make sure they're all in. Next thing you would do is you would push your mixture to full rich. So on this aircraft, you take that red knob and push it all the way in. That'd be mixture full rich. Then what you do is make sure your carb heat's in the cold position. Again, I'll talk about in a later video what the carb heat is. We're just going to leave it off or cold the entire time. Then you'd prime it as needed. So the primer, like I said, is this black knob. In an earlier section I talked about, that's the primer. You prime it, typically if it's the first start of the day, you prime it 2 times, maybe 3 at the max. You don't want to over prime it. But if you've already started the engine recently, you don't need to prime it. So you only do priming when it hasn't been started in a while. And like I said, about 1 to 3 pumps is about how much you need on the primer. Then you're going to set your throttle. So the throttle on this one, you want it to be slightly in. They say cracked or 1/8 of an inch. What you do, let me zoom in on the throttle over here so I can show you what this looks like. A closer picture of the throttle. I know it's coming up here. Sorry about that. It's kind of spread out in this video, but once I get to the throttle there, engine controls. So the throttle, this is the throttle, that's the mixture. So the throttle, you would pull it all the way back and then just push it in slightly. In the checklist, it says 7 millimeter. I've seen the term cracked used, 1/8 of an inch in, but just slightly in. Basically, that's setting the speed the engines are going to start at, or the RPM. You definitely don't want it all the way in because it's going to start at full speed. And if you don't have it enough pushed in, then it may not start because the engine RPM is too low. All right, so you got your throttle set. You're going to yell clear prop. before you crank the engine. Now I'm going to go zoom in on the area where we crank the engine at. And that's going to be right here. So you would yell clear prop and make sure nobody's in the area of the prop. That's what that means when you're yelling clear prop. Make sure nobody's there that's going to get hit by the arc of the prop. And you'd have your key in this here. And then you would, once you yell clear prop, then you're going to turn your master switch on. So that's where you're going to hit this switch on. The master switch, again, the electrical power switch, you're going to push both those halves up and turn the master switch on. Once the master switch on, that's when you'll hear everything kind of start to purr. Everything comes online. Any lights that are on come on. The radios come on. Everything comes on with that switch. Then you're going to turn your rotating beacon on. There's some light switches here that you would turn on the rotating beacon. That rotating beacon tells people that the engine's about to start or the aircraft's about to move. So anybody outside sees the beacon come on, they can get out of the way. All right, then you're going to turn your ignition switch to start. When you turn it to start, you go all the way to the start position. Engine will crank. Hopefully it starts pretty quick. And then once it starts, you just let go and it spring loads back to both. Okay. And the engine should be started. Now, what do you want to look for after the engine's started? You want to check your engine RPM. Let me go to the tachometer again, or the RPM indicator, so you can see what that looks like. It's right here is its location. That's the far out view. Let's look at the close view. And once it starts, you want to make sure your engine is running at about anywhere from 7,000 to 1,000. 700 to 1,000 RPM, and that's a good idle speed for this plane. Actually, around 800 is about perfect. So you let it run around 800 RPM, and then within 30 seconds, you're going to check that oil pressure indicator, which that oil pressure indicator is in this line of instruments right here. So you would come down here. Let me zoom in closer on that. And your oil pressure, you want to make sure within 30 seconds. It doesn't have to be in the green band within 30 seconds. You just want to make sure you have oil pressure rising within 30 seconds. All right, so that's the engine startup. The thing I wanted to go over real quick is something called a magneto check. So I'm going to go back to the engine start switch. And like I said, there's a video that talks about what a magneto does. You're going to want to watch that. It's only 1 minute long. It definitely helps you explain what a magneto does. But the way these airplanes are set up, one of the magnetos on the engine fires one spark plug in each cylinder, and the other magneto fires the other spark plug in each cylinder. The reason is redundancy. So if you ever lose a magneto, you still have at least spark in every single cylinder. And if you ever lose a spark plug, the other spark plug will still be firing because it's running off a different magneto. So it's a redundancy thing. To where if you had everything running off of one electrical, one magneto, then if that magneto was a fail, now you're looking for a place to land. Well, this, you can still fly the airplane. So anytime the aircraft's in normal operation, they're going to be in both, because you're going to run both. It runs more efficient because you got two spark plugs firing in every cylinder. But if you ever want to troubleshoot the engine or check the magnetos, what you do is you run it at a certain RPM, and there's a RPM in a checklist to do a magneto check. I believe it's 1700 RPM. And what you're going to do is you're going to run the engine at 1700 RPM, and you're going to select left mag, L, first. And you're going to note, you're going to lose a little bit of RPM. And the reason why is because the engine's not going to be running on both magnetos anymore. It's only going to be running on one magneto. So it's going to only get one spark in each cylinder. And it's always more efficient to get two. So you're going to lose a little bit of RPM, but not a lot. That's what they call a mag drop. And there is a specified RPM. It's usually around 100, 150 RPM you're supposed to lose. Then you go back to both, let the engine stabilize, and then you're going to select to the right mag and double check and see what its RPM drop is. And if its RPM drops within the legal parameters, then you go back to both, and that's called a mag drop. If you were to ever go to off, the engine would shut off, but we don't shut engines down that way. I'm going to talk about how to shut engine down here in a second. So that's called a mag check, and this is the magneto switch, also known as the ignition switch on this one because it's the same switch. The magneto switch right, left, both, and start. All right, so we talked about a mag drop there. The last thing I want to talk about is how to shut the thing down. On an airplane, if you turn the key switch off, it will shut down, but we don't shut planes down that way. We actually take the mixture knob and we pull it towards us, and like I talked about earlier, that's called idle cutoff or full lean. When you pull the mixture off, it's going to starve the engine of fuel. Engine's going to die immediately because it's got no more fuel. And then once the engine's off, then you turn the key switch off. Reason being, the reason that you want to shut the engine down with the mixture is because if you don't and you shut it down with the key switch, that's going to leave some fuel in the cylinders, and if somebody turns the propeller and the key switch is on, it could start, and it's a dangerous situation. But if we pull the mixture and the engine dies because it has no fuel, then even if somebody was to turn the prop, it won't start. So we always do that for safety. So engine gets shut down by the mixture knob and not by the key switch or ignition switch. All right, so hopefully you watched this video on an engine start. Like I said, it's tough to do off campus, but I wanted to make sure I had covered it because there's a lot of worksheet questions on it, test questions on it. So I wanted to make sure I went through an engine start. There's also another video where the guy goes through it all at one time, so you can see it. You can watch it multiple times if you need to. Very similar plane. It's a different aircraft, but everything's pretty similar in how it works. So watch that, and then watch the magneto video on how a mag works. And then I also put a video specifically on what the mixture does. Make sure you watch all those videos and you'll be up to date. Tomorrow we're going to cover carb heat. We're going to talk about some problems that could have developed when we're starting these. And we're going to talk about starting of a jet engine. But anyways, you guys watch this video, and I'll have some more videos on there tomorrow on the jet engine starting.